Can a city save the world? I am studying globalization and the effects on studies for now 25, near to 30 years. Yes, I am maybe the oldest person in the room. And I'm pretty convinced that we are living through a transition, through a radical transition that is comparable to the Neolithic revolution and the Industrial Revolution. It is not just a change, it is not just an evolution of the 20th century model. I really think we're living to a radical shift. And so it's time, I think, to speak a bit about politics, about the relationship of power, about the way we really have to relate to those changes. Globalization is urbanization. Let me start with some very elementary figures. In the beginning of the 19th century, only 10% of the world population lived in cities. In the beginning of this century, more than half of the world population lives in cities. And in the next few years, that's going to be 3/4 of the humanity. So in fact, we are becoming an urban animal, and we don't know it yet. We are not fully adapted to that situation. Not only are we all living more and more in cities, we are living more and more in greater cities. Here you see a map of the cities of 1 million inhabitants. In 1950, only London and New York had more than 8 million inhabitants. Today we have 30 global cities of more than 10 million. And we have near to 500 cities of more than 1 million inhabitants. And by the way, you can see that these cities are most coastal cities. So if we don't do anything about climate change, and we are not dealing with that challenge, there will be sea level rise, and millions of people will have to look for another place on the globe. If we look at Europe, this is the reality of Europe today. What we really see is the late medieval urban settlement in Europe. The Low Countries, northern Italy, and then related with the Rhine. That is the central area of Europe. That is the blue banana. Within less than 20% of the surface, you have more than 60% of the population and 72% of the GDP produced. So Europe is a center-periphery dynamics. And the world is becoming more and more a connection, a space of flows between cities. The global system is a global system of urban activity connected with each other. And how is all that represented? Still in this way. Europe is told to our kids being a collection of states, of countries. You see the big country of France, with the French flag, and behind that flag, all French people, of course. Or the country with the largest population, Germany, with the German flag, and with Germans living there. Except for the 4 million of Turks living there. But what are they doing there? They have their own little territory with their own flag. Basically, we are still in the mental map of the 19th century with bounded territories, countries, with one language, with the same kind of people, with the same kind of identity, with the same kind of history. In fact, whereas in reality, we are living in a continent that is of that kind, in a space of flows between cities. Let's have a look at this global system. I do think that we are challenged with 3 big challenges in the world. And with that specific characteristic today, that they will not be resolved without human agency. These challenges need a global agenda, need global citizens, need global politics. Our first challenge is related to our human relationship with nature. We have used nature in the 20th century as a resource, and we have increased our ecological footprint in such a way that the biological capacity of nature to restore that has been trespassed. It is impossible anymore to use nature as we did, to play with biodiversity as we did, without becoming responsible for our own destruction. And of course, climate change is the most immediate challenge there. Global warming is gonna change the relationship with water, with the sea. There is going to be sea level rise, and as I showed you already in the map, a lot of settlements will have to be replaced. And of course, if 600 million Bangladeshi need to find another place, I let you think that they will not start the same kind of life 20 kilometers inwards, of course. There will be big movements around in the next few decades. The second big challenge is the inhuman social inequality. If you see the situation that nearly 70% of the population has to live on only 3% of the wealth, that the other 22% of the population have 13%, so that nearly more than 80% of the world population lives on less than 20% of the wealth production, and that less than 1% owns 40%, it is impossible to go on like that. It is not just a question of injustice. It is a question that this kind of private money orients economy in an unsustainable way, is producing for purchasing power and not for human needs. And so we are living in a global system today that is also socially unsustainable. And the third aspect, already related to that a bit, is that today the world has become super diverse. Not only because of migration, not only because millions of people do not live in their country or their territory of origin, but also because lifestyles have evolved in such a way that a lot of people do not live the same lives anymore in their national community. And so what we really are faced with is multi-communitarian cities. I'm living in Brussels, the capital of Europe. 1/3 of the population there does not have a Belgian ID card. But a lot of the immigrants have become Belgian over time. So 60% in total of the population has no Belgo-Belgian reference system. And as you know, the Belgians are really very generous. They even offer in their country 2 types of national integration. And so in my city, we have Flemish schools and French-speaking schools, Flemish cultural centers and French-speaking cultural centers. We have theaters of the 2 languages, and the majority of the population is not relating to that. So basically, this whole idea of building society on the basis of one community, of a national community, is not fit to the urban condition today. So if we take these 3 systemic challenges, our relationship with nature has to be restored. Social inequality has been radically changed. And we need a cosmopolitan idea of society. We see that these 3 systemic challenges are not dealt with in the international political world as it is organized today. Countries do not deal with this question. Countries are basically led by suburban people. And what you see happening is that these global challenges are immediate problems in cities. We are not dealing with climate change as an abstract challenge in cities. We have air pollution. We have the traffic jams. We have to reorganize the cities in such a way that they become sustainable. We have problems with food supply, with food chains. And so a sustainable urban ecosystem is a problem, is a challenge in each city of a certain size. We have a social geographical inequality in cities. All the cities have a lot of poor people. Again, to give the example of my city, in Brussels, it's the second richest region in Europe, following Eurostat. But at the same time, we have 1/3 of the population living on or below poverty line. We have 710,000 jobs in the city. But at the same time, we have 110,000 unemployed people. We have youth unemployment in some areas of the city of more than 50%. Such a city cannot survive if it doesn't tackle really social inequality. And you can globally not relate to that. You can have international boards that are just relating to bank figures or to economic figures and not relating to the real condition of people. In cities, you have to deal with that. And thirdly, a city is not a country. In a city, you live together on the basis of difference. And you have to deal with that, whether you like it or not. The old model of national identities, of identical communities that form the ground layer of society is anti-urban, is not possible to sustain in cities. And so cities are ahead of countries. Cities are more close to the world, closer to the world system, and countries, in fact, are in between of this urban system and the global system. And so the question is there. If the world is only ruled by nation states, by international meetings, by intergovernmental negotiations, we will have an ongoing situation like the Kyoto agreements, 20 years already, that are not applied. So people sign international treaties and they do not bind the countries to really apply to the urgency of these global challenges. In 2013, our colleague Benjamin Barber wrote this book, If Mayors Rule the World. In the book, he looks at the relationship between cities and the global system. And he already notes empirically that a lot of the global questions are dealt with in cities. But what is not there, cities are not really global players. Mayors, representatives of the cities, do not have international platforms, international meetings where they can decide on global questions. And that's why in the book and later in the book, we discussed this proposal of having a global parliament of mayors alongside the UN, having a global parliament of cities, in fact, dealing with global matters and global questions as an important project. And the project was discussed in conferences in Asia, in the United States, North America, last year in Amsterdam with European mayors. And in fact, the project now is carried by a number of cities so that next October 2015, the first global parliament of mayors will be organized in London and also in Bristol by Mayor Ferguson, who is one of the forerunners in this whole project. So I really think that all the examples that we have seen of new citizenship, of new ways of dealing with sustainable challenges, with social inequality, with neoliberal egocentrism, changing that into collaborative networks of people, have to be, let's say, expressed politically by forcing our mayors not only to make an ecosystemic and a social equal model for the city, but also projecting that to the global system. Because otherwise, it will not be possible in tackling really all the challenges that we have been discussing this whole evening, if we only look at it locally, if we only look at it at the small scale. We really have to think on how we really are going to change the relationship of forces at the global scale. And we have seen, for instance, with the whole Greek question, that's not an easy question. It is not because we decide to do it in a certain way, that then the system in general reacts to that. Because basically, in the last few years, democracy has not been increased, but has been really tackled since the bank crisis and being challenged. So my proposal here is we have to make cities political global players, and alongside states and countries give a voice to the urban question, to urbanity, because if the world has to be saved, it is only, I think, through making urbanity the way of living together. Making urbanity, let's say, the model of human living together, and that means making urbanity a post-national way of living. So let me end this talk with, let's say, a more philosophical, a more general thought. It took us 1 century, the 18th century, the century of enlightenment, to think the possibility of living together without sharing religion. That was a difficult talk, and the Dutch, in fact, were the first to make a multi-religious state, to abolish state religion, to separate the state from religion. And that is now defended as one of the basic elements of modernity, basic of the modern democratic state. That is that politics do not derive from religion, but politics do derive from a democratic sovereign system with the citizens all together. I even think that the majority of the world population is not even convinced of that model. No state religion. But what happened in the 19th century, basically 200 years ago, after the defeat of Napoleon, Europe was organized with the idea of nation states. No national religion, but a national culture. The ideal was one language, one people, one culture, one identity, one tradition, bounded within countries and different from the country nearby. And it is that model that has been transported to other places in the world, because the world system is a European world system. Through colonialism, through redesigning the world alongside that European model, we put countries everywhere. It's a pretty good system, and the world is full of countries. There is no place where there is no country, and there's no place where there are 2 countries. In fact, it is well designed. Look at the maps of Africa. Sometimes it's designed, I think, in a cafe on a little piece of paper, and you have borders that probably are not to be found back in the real geography. That delivered a 20th century with that productivist capitalist model, with what has been called technological progress. But at the same time, 2 world wars. At the same time, ethnic cleansing. At the same time, a century of genocides, of the Holocaust. Because the idea was we live together ideally with cultural identity, and let's say a pure cultural identity was the model. In cities, we have to change that mental map. In cities, we have to live together on the basis of difference. And we will more and more have cities with not a leading community, not even the original national community. Cities will become mixed. Everybody can have its community, but society will become intercultural, intercommunitarian, and I think that has to be thought. How to live together without being member of the same community. How to live together, how to be a citizen of a society that is not based on one identity, but is based on multicultural, on intercultural interaction. And that is basically what cities are about. Living together on the basis of difference in a world of a space of flows where the active metropolis will be the basis of human concentration related with other places of the world, and where we have to think a global society, citizens of the world concentrated in urban networks and in the bigger cities. It is that transition, I think, that needs a new century of enlightenment. It is very difficult to think completely today, but let's invite ourselves. It's the end of the evening. At the end of this century also, I'll come back then, and we'll make a balance sheet of how we have thought and put into practice this transition But without that transition, the world will not be saved. So I really think that urbanity as a post-national project is the political project that we have to put in movement from today onwards, and it's going to last some generations to reframe our mindset in that direction. Thank you for your attention.